scripture, Proverbs 29:2. Proverbs 29:2 says, when the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice. When the wicked rule, people mourn. Do you realize that approximately 50 million Christians are not voting? If Christians are not voting, if Christians are not even running for office, what is left? The wicked electing the wicked. And it becomes our fault. It becomes our fault. You know, the other day, I was talking to somebody. As a matter of fact, it was a pastor. And the pastor said, well, God put Obama in power. And I said, no, God didn't put Obama in power. We put Obama in power by sitting on our rear ends in our pews. Let me tell you. Don't blame God for our failures. Don't blame God for our failures. You know, I remember back in 2012, this happened in 2 different churches. I had whole families that came to me and said, we never voted in our lives because of Romans 13. Because Romans 13 says that God appoints all authority, and if God appoints all authority, why vote? You know what my response was? That's got to be the stupidest thing I've ever heard in my life. That's a total misunderstanding of Romans 13. You know something? God appoints the authority. We elect the person that sits on that authority. Let me share something with you. For millennia, the model for government has always been the same. This is man's made model, not God's model, but man's made model. And that model has always been authority flows from God to the government to the people. I repeat, this is not God's model, it is man's model. Authority flows from God to the government to the people. Even in the Old Testament, if you go to 1 Samuel chapter 8, you find something very interesting. The people of Israel come to the prophet Samuel and say, they demand, we want a king like all the other nations around us have. You see, before then, they were ruled by judges that rose up from among the people. Now they demanded a king, and they placed themselves under that same man-made model. Authority flows from God to the government to the people. And kings and tyrants throughout history have used that model to justify their oppression of the people. Basically, they would say, I have the right to oppress you because I get my authority from God. But you see, a little over 200 years ago, when those framers were on their knees, seeking revelation from above, divine revelation is what they got. I believe without a shadow of a doubt that the reason the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States have lasted over 2 centuries is because they were forged on the knees of the framers. And God gave those framers, by divine revelation, a different model for government. No longer authority flows from God to the government to the people, but rather authority flows from God to the people to the government. From God to the people to the government. Revolutionary concept. It is not coincidental that the first 3 words in the Constitution are we the people. Because the Constitution, as I said again, by divine revelation, places all authority upon us. And with that authority comes an awesome responsibility for us to elect righteous leaders. And if we do not elect righteous leaders, we are disobeying God. Now, let me shock you again. Did you know that the Bible tells you exactly who to vote for? The Bible tells you exactly who to vote for. Let me put it in context. Moses has just crossed the Red Sea. And now Moses is in the wilderness trying to govern over 1 million people. And literally, Moses is going bananas. And here comes his father-in-law, Jethro. And Jethro says, Moses, what you're doing is not good. And in Exodus chapter 18, verse 21, God speaks to Moses through Jethro. And God says, you select from among the people. Now note that God doesn't say, I will appoint. No. You select, which is the same as you elect from among the people. And now he gives 4 qualifications. Able men, such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness. Able men, such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness. Let's define those terms. Able men and women, of course. What does that mean? That means elect men and women who are capable of doing the job. Let's stop electing the village idiot. Number 2, such as fear God. Well, what does it mean to fear God? Well, if you fear God, you obey God's precepts. We call that in America a Judeo-Christian ethic. What is a Judeo-Christian ethic? Well, first of all, it's a moral code of conduct. And then it is honesty, integrity, hard work, individual responsibility, the rule of law, and yes, free enterprise and limited government. And the Bible has a lot to say about all of those. So able men, such as fear God. Number 3, men of truth. Let me ask you a question. Aren't you sick and tired of men and women of lies in government? They tell you one lie to cover up the previous lie. And it is lies upon lies upon lies, whether it is Fast and Furious, or Benghazi, or the IRS, or the NSA, or Ebola, or ISIS. It is all lies upon lies.
I can have my own doctor.
That's another lie. Well, let me ask you another question. Have you ever come across a candidate for public office that will tell you all these wonderful things they're going to do, only to get elected and do exactly the opposite? Anybody? But you know something? That one is easy to fix. All you have to do is follow this statement. Stop listening to their rhetoric and start looking at their record. Stop listening to what they say, start looking at what they do. Jesus put it this way: ye shall know them by their fruit. It's about time we do some fruit checking. So able men, such as fear God, men of truth. Number 4, hating covetousness. But let me tell you a secret. Covetousness in government is not primarily about money. It is about power and control. Politicians covet power, and they covet the control that power gives them over we the people. That's why we have politicians in Washington that have been there for 30 years. And they want to be there another 20. They don't want to relinquish that power. They get drunk with that power. Lord Acton said, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Okay, able men, such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness, and the scripture continues. And set them up as rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, rulers of 50s, rulers of 10. So what do we see? We see Moses, rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, rulers of 50s, rulers of 10. That's equivalent to federal government, state government, county government, local government. Verse 22. And only bring up to Moses, that is to the federal government, matters of great importance. Everything else you handle yourself at the local level. That is the essence of limited government. That's Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. That's the 9th Amendment. That's the 10th Amendment. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution is called the enumerated powers of Congress. 18 powers described in Article 1, Section 8. If it's not there, federal government's got no business being involved in it. Let me give you a couple of examples. The word education, nowhere in Article 1, Section 8. Now let me ask you something. Does it make any sense to have a bunch of unelected bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. telling us how to educate our children and grandchildren? No. Or to cram down our throats Common Core, which is nothing but secular humanism and mind control? No, that decision needs to be at the local level with parents and teachers and a local school board. Let me tell you another word that is not in Article 1, Section 8. It's the word environment. Nowhere in Article 1, Section 8. Let me tell you, there are two entities of the federal government that have been done more to destroy our economy than any other. It is the EPA and the Endangered Species Act. Thousands upon thousands upon thousands of regulations. And that's every month. Today, it's almost impossible for anyone to start a new business because of all the regulations you have to go through. But, according to Article 1, Section 8, Department of Agriculture, the Department of Education, on Constitution. EPA, on Constitution. Now, we have to have any kind of regulations. They need to be at the state level, not at the federal level. And it's only common sense. But you see what's happening with departments like the EPA, you have all these regulators. If they don't come up with new regulations, they can't justify their job. All right, let's continue. You look at the Declaration of Independence. And in the Declaration of Independence, there are 17 grievances against King George. But did you know that each and every one of those 17 grievances were preached from the pulpits of America before they were written on the Declaration? It was preachers from the pulpit calling out King George for the atrocities that the British were perpetrating upon the American people. Where are those preachers today? They're hiding behind their pulpits. Let me ask you a trivia question. Do you know where Paul Revere was going when he was going on his famous ride? The British are coming, the British are coming. He was going somewhere. He was going to the home of a pastor by the name of Jonas Clark. At the home of Pastor Jonas Clark were two of the patriots, John Hancock and Samuel Adams. Of course, you know that our first battle for our independence was the Battle of Lexington. But do you know who led the Battle of Lexington? Pastor Jonas Clark. You know who were the men fighting with him? The men from his congregation. Let me tell you about another pastor. His name was Peter Muhlenberg. Pastor Peter Muhlenberg was one of many pastors that were greatly feared by the British Army. They called them the Black Robe Regiment because all these pastors wore long black robes. Well, Pastor Peter Muhlenberg is preaching at his church one Sunday on Ecclesiastes chapter 3. He concludes his sermon with verse 8, which says there's a time for peace and a time for war. And he says, this is a time for war. He begins unbuttoning his black robe, and as he takes it off, it shows off his colonel's uniform in the Continental Army. He turns to his congregation and he says, "How many of you men will follow me to go fight for our independence?" That Sunday, 300 men followed Pastor Peter Muhlenberg to go fight for our independence. That's our heritage. You know, the liberal media, this current government will try to tell you that the Constitution and the Declaration are secular documents, that the framers were a bunch of secularists. Nothing could be further from the truth. Did you know that 29 of the 56 signers of the Declaration, over half, were seminary graduates? These were deeply committed men of God. As a matter of fact, the two most reviled framers, the ones that the liberals always like to talk about, you know who they are? Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin. Let me tell you about those two men. First, Thomas Jefferson. Well, Thomas Jefferson was the writer of the Declaration of Independence, which is all about exalting God, that all the rights we come by our Creator. Let me tell you about the one they call the most ungodly of all the framers, the deist, Benjamin Franklin. The Constitutional Convention had been going for about 4 weeks, and those delegates were at each other's necks. The convention was about to fall apart, and it was this ungodly deist, Benjamin Franklin, that addresses a very godly man, the president of the convention, George Washington. And he said, "Sir, how is it that we have not once called upon the Father of lights to illuminate our understanding? Or have we forgotten when we began this struggle against Great Britain, how we met in this very chamber for prayer, seeking his protection and direction? Those prayers were graciously answered. Or we believe that we no longer need his assistance?" He continued, "Sir, I have lived a long life, and the longer I live, the more assured I am of this truth, that God governs the affairs of men." That's not the statement of the deist. But he continues, "If a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that we can build an empire without his aid? As the scripture tells us, unless the Lord builds the house, they labor in vain that build it." He continues, "If we proceed to build this without him, we will fare no better than the builders of Babel." And he concluded by saying, "I beseech you therefore, that from now henceforth, before we proceed with our deliberations, we meet for prayer every morning in this chamber, seeking his direction and his wisdom." They left the chamber that day, and the next day they all went to the church of Brother Witherspoon, one of the signers of the Declaration. They came back the next day in a totally different spirit. And a few weeks later, they gave us the greatest document that has ever been written outside of the Bible, the Constitution of the United States of America.